I used to love people to read to me. And my parents would read to me, and I had lots of uncles and aunts. And I would ask them all to read to me. And they did, but it was never enough. I always wanted more. And that's why I wanted to read. When I was 4 years old, I was desperate to learn to read. And my mother taught me to read, and I learned very easily, very quickly. And of course, I have been reading ever since. When I was 12 years old, I read a James Bond novel by Ian Fleming. And I thought it was wonderful. I wanted to be James Bond. Now, eventually I realized that I was never going to be tall enough to be James Bond.
Really?
Well, James Bond is, I don't know, 190 centimeters, something like this. Anyway, I wasn't a tough guy. I was a reader. The tough guys are in the gym, punching the punch bag. No, that was never going to happen. And so the idea of writing about a character like James Bond came to me at some point. And my first novel, which I wrote when I was, I think, 23, was about a James Bond type character. It wasn't a very good novel, by the way. I started to write spy stories. And of course, it's not really difficult to create danger for a spy. A spy is always in danger. He's always telling lies, always hiding. But I felt that it would be more exciting if what the spy was doing related to some real episode in history, like a battle, or a war, or a revolution, so that the reader would feel that what the spy was doing was really important, not just shooting people or saving his own life or escaping from a prison, but it was really important to the world. I thought that would be a more interesting story. And so I began to read history to look for moments in history when the work of a spy changed the course of history, or might have changed the course of history. And that began my study of history. I wrote a trilogy of 3 books about the 20th century, beginning with the outbreak of the First World War and ending with the fall of the Berlin Wall. And something I noticed, in each book there are people fighting for their freedom. Sometimes it's women suffragettes demanding the vote, African Americans demanding civil rights, coal miners demanding trade union rights, all these things. And I notice that everything proceeds 2 steps forward, 1 step back. There is development, there's progress, and then there's reaction. And this is how things seem to happen in politics. But the thing to remember is that it is 2 steps forward and 1 back. It's not 1 step forward and 2 steps back. We do make progress. And if you think about what the world was like at the beginning of my trilogy, the first book is called Fall of Giants, begins in 1914. And if you think about what the world was like in 1914, women didn't have the vote anywhere. Most working class men did not have the vote in most European countries. In the United States, African Americans were persecuted, often murdered, dreadful, dreadful treatment. Jews, it was common to dislike Jews. That was normal. The world has improved tremendously in the last 100 years. We do make progress. Sometimes we're discouraged, and obviously something like Brexit, Donald Trump's speech about Mexicans, and we think, oh God, that's supposed to be all over. That's the past. This crap. But it's come back, and we feel despair. But we just remember we must keep working at it, because slowly, slowly, slowly we make the world a better place. In the 19th century and the 20th century, nationalism could be progressive. So, for example, when the Vietnamese people said, we are Vietnamese. This is our country. We don't want the French to rule us. We don't want the Americans to rule us. We are the Vietnamese. That's nationalism. But it was progressive because it was anti-colonial. And anti-colonial movements were normally nationalist. In the third world, in Africa, people said, you know, we are Kenyan. We are Nigerian. We don't need to be ruled by white people from London or wherever. So it was progressive. But it isn't now. Nationalism now is taking us backwards. The future for all of us is a future in which we all live more closely together. And we all work together, we do business together, we must learn each other's languages. I'm sorry I don't speak Spanish. But we and our kids, I tell my grandchildren the best thing you can do in school is languages, because all your life that will be helpful to you. That's the world of the future. Not the world where we all withdraw and we say, we're the British and we're the best. That's crap. That's the old way of doing things. That's my opinion. There's a series of books that are very popular in England, still popular I think, about a character called Noddy. And he's a toy. He's like a puppet with a big red hat. And of course he's like a small child. And so it's like reading about yourself. And I loved those stories. Noddy Goes to Toy Town. Wonderful, wonderful. And I read them to my children and to my grandchildren. Live and Let Die, which is the second one. And it begins, in the life of a secret agent, there are moments of great luxury. And that one sentence sums up the James Bond appeal. It's the secret agent, thrilling, exciting, and great luxury. All the things he has, the wine, the cars, the cigarettes, and of course the beautiful women. So that absolutely captivated me. As it turned out, that was not the kind of book that I was destined to write. I never created a character like James Bond who appeared in a series of books. There is a long biography of him, three volumes, which was very important for me in writing A Column of Fire, because it tells the true story of his life, and in great detail. So, really everything that is known about espionage in the 16th century is in this biography of Walsingham. And of course, it's full of parallels with the modern times. Surprisingly enough, I suppose, the spies of the 16th century did many of the same things that the spies do today. Now, I can think of books that explain the 20th century. For example, George Orwell's book 1984 tells you what everybody was scared of in the 20th century. I've just read Bob Woodward's book, Fear, about Donald Trump. It's brilliant. It's a very good book. He is clearly the greatest journalist of our times, Bob Woodward, because this is inside the White House. And if you wanted a book to explain what's happening in the year 2018, I think it would be Fear by Bob Woodward. Well, I read Proust all the time. I don't read the whole thing, it's 7 books, but I read bits of it. I have read the whole thing in English, and now I read portions of it in French. And it's exactly like that. It's fresh every time. I understand it better every time I read it. And the fascination continues. Proust is a very peculiar writer. He ought not to be popular. There's no story. And he writes these long sentences which can be quite difficult to figure out. He does everything wrong. But somehow he exercises a fascination, Proust. He's the one that I go back to all the time. The Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris. the book that introduced us to Hannibal Lecter, the most scary villain in all of fiction. Yes, I read that book, and I thought, I wish I'd written The Silence of the Lambs. Probably the scariest thriller of the 20th century. Wonderful, wonderful book. Now, I read a book recently called An Odyssey. The author is an American. His name is Daniel Mendelsohn, and he's a teacher of Greek literature. And the story is about how his father came to his lectures. Okay? So he's lecturing about Homer's book, The Odyssey, and his dad is in the audience. So it's a book about Homer, and it's a book about fathers and sons. And his dad says, he teaches literature. His dad is a mathematician. His dad says, I'm going to come to your class, but I won't say anything. I'll be silent. I will never say anything. And the first day he says, no, that's not right. Argues with his son. So I found it completely fascinating, and I've given it to several of my men friends, because, you know, we talk all the time about our fathers and our sons. And here is a book that's a kind of an adventure that a father and son take together. The father attends this whole course of lectures, and then the two of them take a cruise on a ship in the Mediterranean, and they go to the places that Odysseus visited on his great voyage that is the subject of the book, the poem. And as it turns out, that's the last year of his father's life. His father is in his 80s. This man, Mendelssohn, is in his 50s, I guess. And so it's also, in the end, it's a reflection on his father's life and his own life. Very moving book, very nicely written, very thoughtful, and quite unusual.